Mrs. Evelyn Marshall, an 82-year-old woman with silver-streaked hair and a proud, graceful bearing, had lived in her quiet suburban neighborhood for nearly 30 years. The neighborhood, with its rows of well-kept lawns and tree-lined streets, had seen many changes over the years, but Mrs. Marshall had remained a constant figure, a gentle, soft-spoken widow with a warm smile that greeted everyone she met. She was known for her kindness, often baking cookies for the neighborhood children or offering a helping hand to anyone in need. Despite her age, Mrs. Marshall was fiercely independent, preferring to take care of herself and maintain her daily routines without relying on others. Each morning, she enjoyed taking long walks around the block, listening to the birds sing and the wind rustle through the leaves. It was her time to reflect, to remember the life she'd shared with her late husband, Thomas, and to think of her son, David, who had grown up in this very neighborhood before moving away for his successful career as a lawyer. Though she was alone, Mrs. Marshall found solace in these peaceful walks, her mind wandering between fond memories and the simple joy of nature. On this particular day, the sun was shining brightly, casting a golden hue over the manicured lawns and flower beds. Mrs. Marshall set out on her usual walk, her cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk. She wore her favorite wide-brimmed hat, the one David had bought her for her birthday last year, and a light cardigan to keep away the morning chill. As she walked, she smiled at the familiar sights around her. Mrs. Rodriguez tending to her roses, the Johnson kids riding their bikes up and down the street, and the friendly mailman, Mr. Harvey, waving as he passed by in his truck. But something felt different today. As she approached the corner, she noticed a police cruiser parked at the end of the block, just outside her line of sight. Two officers sat inside, their eyes locked onto her with an intensity that immediately made her uncomfortable. She paused for a moment, gripping her cane a little tighter, but then shook her head and continued walking. It's nothing, she thought, just police doing their job. Mrs. Marshall tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping into her chest, but as she continued her walk, she noticed the cruiser slowly pulling out and trailing behind her at a distance. The sound of the engine idling seemed to grow louder in her ears with every step. Glancing back over her shoulder, she saw the two officers watching her closely, their expressions unreadable behind their sunglasses. Officer Brad Weston and Officer Mitchell Quinn had been on patrol that morning, bored and restless after an uneventful shift. When they spotted Mrs. Marshall, an elderly black woman walking alone in what they perceived to be an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood, their assumptions kicked in. They exchanged glances, silently agreeing that something about her didn't sit right. It was nothing but a hunch, but in their eyes she didn't belong here. As Mrs. Marshall rounded a corner, she heard the distinct sound of the cruiser's tires rolling to a stop. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized they were getting out of the car. She felt a surge of apprehension, but kept her head high and continued walking, hoping to avoid any confrontation. "Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am." Officer Weston's voice boomed across the street, shattering the quiet of the morning. Mrs. Marshall stopped and turned slowly, her hands trembling slightly on the handle of her cane. The two officers were approaching her, their heavy boots echoing off the pavement. Officer Weston, a burly man with a stern face, led the way, while Officer Quinn, younger and more uncertain, followed closely behind. "Yes, officers, how can I help you?" Mrs. Marshall asked, her voice calm but laced with the tension she felt growing in her chest. Weston's eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down, his expression one of suspicion. "We have some reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Marshall blinked in confusion, her brow furrowing. "I'm taking a walk," she replied softly. "I live just a few houses down." "Is that so?" Weston responded, unconvinced. He exchanged a glance with Officer Quinn, who shifted uncomfortably. "We haven't seen you around here before. Can you prove that you live here?" Mrs. Marshall felt a chill run down her spine. She had lived in this neighborhood longer than these officers had probably been on the force, yet here she was, being interrogated as if she were a stranger. "I don't carry my identification when I go for a walk," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I've lived here for many years. You can ask any of my neighbors." Weston took a step closer, his large frame looming over her. "I don't think you understand the situation, ma'am," he said in a menacing tone. "You're acting pretty suspicious for someone who just claims to be out for a walk." Mrs. Marshall's eyes widened in disbelief. "Suspicious? How am I being suspicious?" she asked, her voice trembling now. She glanced around, hoping that someone would step in, but the few people who had gathered nearby watched silently, their eyes filled with pity but their mouths shut. "I don't know," Weston said with a smirk, crossing his arms over his chest. "Maybe you're scoping out houses. Maybe you're looking for something or someone." "That's enough," Mrs. Marshall said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm just an old woman trying to enjoy my morning. I'm not doing anything wrong." Officer Quinn, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should just let her go, Brad. She doesn't seem like she's doing anything." But Weston shot him a sharp look. "Quiet, Quinn. This is standard procedure." Tears began to well in Mrs. Marshall's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had been through so much in her life: segregation, discrimination, the loss of her husband, and she wasn't about to let these officers make her feel small. Still, the fear gnawed at her, a reminder of how easily things could spiral out of control. Weston continued to berate her, his words growing more aggressive as he accused her of lying, of being somewhere she didn't belong. He questioned her repeatedly, each time ignoring her attempts to explain. To him, she was just another suspect, a figure to be controlled and intimidated. Meanwhile, one of the neighbors, Mrs. Rodriguez, stood frozen on her porch, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. She had known Mrs. Marshall for years, knew how kind and harmless she was, but fear kept her rooted in place. She wanted to speak up, to tell the officers they were wrong, but the weight of their authority silenced her. Across the street, a young man pulled out his phone and began recording, his face a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Others in the neighborhood watched from behind their windows, unwilling to get involved but eager to see how things would play out. Mrs. Marshall stood her ground, refusing to be cowed by the officer's intimidation, but inside, she felt her strength wavering. She couldn't believe that after all these years, she was still facing this kind of treatment, treated as less than human simply because of the color of her skin. As the tension escalated, Mrs. Marshall reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she tried to send a message to her son. She didn't know if he would be able to come, but she needed to let him know what was happening. Before she could finish typing, Officer Weston grabbed the phone from her hand, his expression cold and unfeeling. "That's enough," he said. "You're coming with us." Mrs. Marshall's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't go quietly. The tension in the air thickened as Officer Brad Weston's demeanor shifted from merely accusatory to outright hostile. His eyes, cold and sharp, bore down on Mrs. Marshall, who stood trembling but resolute. The young officer, Mitchell Quinn, lingered nervously in the background, clearly uncomfortable with how things were unfolding but too inexperienced, or too scared, to intervene. "You don't belong here, do you, lady?" Weston sneered, his voice low and menacing. His eyes flickered with something cruel, something that made Mrs. Marshall's stomach churn. "Look at you, walking around here like you own the place. Bet you never worked a day in your life, living off government checks, right? Taking strolls while the rest of us pay for your lazy life." Mrs. Marshall's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a blow. She had lived her entire life with dignity, raising her son after her husband's death, working as a nurse until she retired. The idea that she could be reduced to such a stereotype, after all she had endured, stung deeply. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cracking slightly but still full of quiet strength. "I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you've probably been alive. I've worked hard every day of my life." Weston let out a harsh laugh. "Sure you have, Grandma. Look, we know your type. You think just because you've got a nice house here that you're one of them. He gestured to the surrounding homes, implying the predominantly white residents. But let's be honest, you're not fooling anyone. Officer Quinn shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Weston and Mrs. Marshall. He wasn't as seasoned as Weston, and the older officer's blatant racism made him uneasy. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but quickly closed it, unwilling to go against his superior. Mrs. Marshall's heart raced as Weston's words became increasingly vile. She wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of treatment. She had lived through the civil rights movement, survived the Jim Crow era, but it never got easier. It never stopped feeling like a betrayal of her humanity. "I'm just trying to get home," Mrs. Marshall said, her voice strained as she fought to keep her composure. "I've lived here for years. I'm not causing any trouble." "Right, because a sweet old lady like you would never be up to anything suspicious," Weston retorted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from hers. "But we both know the truth, don't we?" Mrs. Marshall's hands tightened around her cane as a wave of fear surged through her. She had never felt so small, so powerless. But she knew that standing her ground was her only option. She would not let them reduce her to a stereotype, nor would she let them intimidate her into silence. "Please," she said softly, her eyes locking with Officer Quinn's for a fleeting moment, hoping for some shred of humanity in him. "I just want to call my son. He'll explain everything." "Your son," Weston mocked, his tone growing harsher. "And what's he gonna do? Sweep in here and save you? Or is he one of those deadbeats who never calls his dear old mom?" He laughed again, a deep, ugly sound that made Mrs. Marshall's skin crawl. Her heart ached at the insult. Her son David was her pride and joy. A man who had worked his way through law school while serving in the military, someone who had built a career on justice and fairness. But there was no way these officers would know that. They didn't care. To them, she was just another faceless, powerless black woman. Mrs. Marshall's thoughts began to drift, the situation becoming too overwhelming. She remembered the day her son had enlisted in the military. David had been barely 20, full of hope and ambition. He had served his country with pride, and after his years of service, had transitioned into law with the same sense of duty. She had been so proud of him. Her late husband, Thomas, a civil rights activist who had marched alongside Dr. King, would have been proud too. Thomas had passed away years earlier, but his legacy lived on in David, a man committed to fighting injustice. She thought of the day David had graduated from law school, wearing his military uniform underneath his robe. He had been one of the few black men in his class, a fact that only strengthened his resolve to fight for those who had been silenced for too long. Mrs. Marshall had shed tears of joy that day, knowing that her son was carrying on the values his father had held so dear. But now, all that pride and hope felt distant as Officer Weston continued to berate her, his words becoming sharper, crueler. "You think you can just walk around and expect us to treat you differently because you're old? Because you've got some sad story about living here for years? You're nobody," Weston growled, stepping even closer, his hand now resting on the taser strapped to his belt. "And nobody messes with us." Mrs. Marshall's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. The sight of Weston's hand so close to his weapon sent a shiver down her spine. She knew how quickly these situations could escalate. She had seen the news, the tragic stories of people who had been in her exact position, only to have things spiral out of control in an instant. "I'm not resisting," Mrs. Marshall said, her voice trembling as she tried to keep her emotions in check. "I'm just trying to explain." Weston cut her off, his face twisted with anger. "Oh, now you're going to pull the 'I'm innocent' card, huh? We've heard it all before. The 'I didn't do anything' excuse. Well, guess what? You don't get to decide that. We do." His hand hovered menacingly over the taser, his eyes cold and unyielding. Mrs. Marshall's pulse raced. She reached again for her phone, desperately trying to make the call to her son. Her fingers fumbled with the screen, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as fear overtook her. But before she could dial David's number, Weston snatched the phone from her hand, his grip tight and unrelenting. "That's enough," he barked, his face inches from hers. "You're not calling anyone." Mrs. Marshall's heart sank as she watched her phone disappear into Weston's pocket. She felt helpless, trapped. But more than that, she felt angry. Angry that even after all these years, all the progress she thought had been made, she was still standing on the receiving end of this hatred. Angry that she had to fight for her dignity in a neighborhood where she had lived for decades, among people who had seen her face every day, but now watched from a distance, unwilling to help. The silence from the crowd of neighbors that had gathered only deepened her sense of isolation. She saw faces she recognized, people who had smiled at her just days ago, waved to her from their porches, but now stood frozen, afraid to get involved. Mrs. Rodriguez, the kindly woman from across the street, was one of them. Her eyes were filled with concern, but she made no move to step forward, her fear too great. Officer Quinn looked down at the ground, clearly disturbed by Weston's behavior, but too unsure of himself to step in. His hesitation was palpable, and Mrs. Marshall noticed it, but it offered her little comfort in the moment. Weston's grip on the taser tightened, and for a terrifying moment, Mrs. Marshall feared he might actually use it. Her body trembled as she fought to keep control, but inside, she felt like a fragile glass teetering on the edge of breaking. Then, in the distance, she heard the sound of a car pulling up. The tires squealed slightly as the vehicle came to a halt. Mrs. Marshall's pulse quickened, and a flicker of hope ignited in her chest. She knew that sound. It was the familiar hum of her son's car. David had come. Her heart swelled with relief, but she knew the situation was far from over. She could only pray that David's arrival would change the course of what had already spiraled so far out of control. Weston hadn't noticed yet, too wrapped up in his intimidation tactics to see the figure approaching from behind. But soon they would realize that they had made a grave mistake. As the confrontation between Mrs. Marshall and the officers intensified, the quiet suburban street began to stir with life. Curtains were drawn aside, and doors cracked open as neighbors took notice of the unusual scene unfolding just outside their homes. Normally a peaceful, idyllic street where the most excitement came from a child's bike race or a new car in someone's driveway, the presence of police officers and their growing hostility toward the elderly woman shattered that tranquility. The murmurs started low, like the rustling of leaves on a breezy day, but they soon grew louder as more people gathered on their porches and sidewalks, trying to get a better view. Mrs. Marshall's name floated through the crowd as some recognized her, whispering to one another about the strange sight of officers interrogating the sweet old woman they had seen every morning for years. "That's Evelyn Marshall," a voice murmured from across the street. What could she have possibly done? "Must be a misunderstanding," another neighbor chimed in, though their tone suggested they weren't quite sure. Phones began to emerge from pockets, some held discreetly, others raised boldly in the air, recording the unfolding events. The power of social media had become a weapon of accountability in situations like this, and some of the younger onlookers, well aware of that fact, captured every second on video. Yet despite the growing number of witnesses, not a single person stepped forward to intervene. They were bystanders, passive observers, afraid of getting involved with the police but unwilling to turn away entirely. Mrs. Marshall stood her ground, trying to remain composed despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She had always believed in the goodness of people, had always trusted that when push came to shove, her neighbors would stand up for what was right. But now, as she glanced around, searching the faces of those she had once smiled at and chatted with, she felt the weight of their silence. "Why are you doing this?" Mrs. Marshall asked the officers, her voice calm but strained, desperately trying to understand what had turned a simple morning walk into a confrontation. "What have I done wrong?" Officer Weston crossed his arms over his chest, a smug smirk playing on his lips. "You're loitering, ma'am. You've been wandering around this neighborhood without any apparent reason, and when we asked you for identification, you refused. That's disobeying an officer. Loitering, Mrs. Marshall repeated incredulously, her brow furrowed in confusion. I'm walking in my own neighborhood. I live just down the street. You're still here, aren't you? Weston shot back. That's loitering in my book. And as for disobeying an officer, when we tell you to show identification, you do it. You don't argue, you don't stall, and you certainly don't try to call someone to cover for you. Mrs. Marshall's heart sank. This wasn't about loitering, and they both knew it. This was about power, about control, and about the assumptions they had made the moment they saw her walking down the street. She glanced at Officer Quinn, who stood to the side, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to challenge his partner. I'm not trying to resist, Mrs. Marshall said quietly, looking Weston in the eye. I just want to go home. This is a misunderstanding. But Weston wasn't interested in explanations. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his hand still hovering near his taser. You don't get to decide when this ends, ma'am. We do. And right now, it looks like you're not cooperating. Across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez, an older woman who had lived next to Mrs. Marshall for years, stood on her front porch, wringing her hands. She knew Evelyn well, knew how kind and gentle she was. The sight of the officers treating her this way made Mrs. Rodriguez's stomach turn, but like the others, she hesitated. Fear of the police, fear of what might happen if she intervened, kept her rooted in place. But as she watched Mrs. Marshall's expression shift from confusion to distress, something inside her snapped. With a shaky breath, Mrs. Rodriguez stepped off her porch and began to walk toward the officers. Her legs felt heavy, her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't stand by any longer. Excuse me, she called out, her voice trembling slightly. That woman is my neighbor. She's lived here for years. This has to be a mistake. Both officers turned to look at Mrs. Rodriguez, and for a brief moment, Mrs. Marshall's heart lifted. Maybe, just maybe, someone's voice of reason would change the course of this situation. But Officer Weston wasn't interested in reason. Ma'am, he said coldly, his eyes narrowing at Mrs. Rodriguez. I suggest you go back inside and mind your business. This doesn't concern you. It is my business, Mrs. Rodriguez insisted, though her voice wavered under Weston's glare. She's my friend and she's done nothing wrong. Officer Quinn, who had remained silent for most of the encounter, shifted uncomfortably and opened his mouth to speak. Maybe we should. Quiet, Quinn, Weston snapped, silencing him with a sharp look before turning his attention back to Mrs. Rodriguez. If you don't want to get involved in something you'll regret, I suggest you turn around and go back home. We've got this under control. Mrs. Rodriguez hesitated, her resolve faltering under the weight of Weston's aggression. Her eyes darted to Mrs. Marshall, who stood silently, a mix of fear and sorrow on her face. Mrs. Rodriguez wanted to help, she really did, but the look in Weston's eyes told her there would be consequences if she didn't back down. And so, with a heavy heart, she turned and walked back to her house, casting one last apologetic glance at her friend before disappearing behind her front door. Mrs. Marshall watched her go, her heart sinking further as she realized she was truly on her own. Or so she thought. Despite Weston's earlier confiscation of her phone, Mrs. Marshall had managed to send a quick message to her son, David, moments before. The text was brief and hurried, but it was enough. David, help. Cops, they won't let me go. Across town, David Marshall was in the middle of an important business meeting when his phone buzzed on the table in front of him. At first, he ignored it, focused on the negotiations unfolding between his firm and a high-profile client. But when his phone buzzed again, something told him to check. He glanced down at the screen and felt his blood run cold. The message was from his mother. David's eyes scanned the brief text, and in an instant, his mind was racing. He could see it, his elderly mother, surrounded by police, vulnerable and scared. Rage and fear coursed through him as he excused himself from the meeting. barely offering an explanation to his colleagues as he rushed out of the office. He had always feared something like this might happen. Despite living in an upscale neighborhood and having built a successful career, he knew all too well that in certain eyes, his mother, and even he, would always be seen as less than. But now those fears had materialized, and David knew he had to act quickly. Jumping into his car, David drove through the city streets with a single focus: get to his mother. His mind raced with thoughts of what might be happening, what might have already happened. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of anger and panic rising with every passing minute. Back on the street, the situation was growing more intense. Officer Weston's threats became louder, more aggressive, as Mrs. Marshall stood her ground. The crowd of onlookers had grown, but still, no one stepped forward to help. Some recorded the scene on their phones, others whispered among themselves, but the overwhelming atmosphere was one of fear and uncertainty. Mrs. Marshall, now fully aware that her neighbors wouldn't intervene, took a deep breath and focused on what she could control. She had managed to get a message to David. All she had to do now was hold on until he arrived. But Weston wasn't finished with her. His eyes flicked to the small crowd that had gathered and the phones that were pointed in his direction. The sight of being recorded only seemed to fuel his aggression. "All right, that's it," he barked, stepping forward and reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for loitering and resisting an officer. Let's see how you like that." Mrs. Marshall's heart raced as the metal cuffs gleamed in the sunlight. She knew that being arrested for something so absurd was not just an injustice, it was dangerous. She had seen how these situations could escalate, and she feared what might happen once they got her into the back of that cruiser. As Officer Weston reached for her arm, Mrs. Marshall stood tall, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. "I'm not resisting," she said firmly, locking eyes with him. "And you know this isn't right." But Weston didn't care. He tightened his grip on her arm, ready to force her into compliance, when suddenly a voice cut through the tension, sharp and authoritative. "Get your hands off my mother." David had arrived. David Marshall pulled into the neighborhood like a man on a mission, his mind laser-focused on one thing: getting to his mother. His normally calm, measured demeanor was clouded by a tempest of emotions, a cocktail of fear, anger, and urgency swirling within him. As he turned the corner and saw the scene before him, his heart skipped a beat. A crowd had gathered, much larger than when his mother first sent her desperate message. Neighbors, both familiar and unfamiliar, stood clustered on sidewalks, their faces etched with concern and curiosity. Phones were still raised, capturing every second of the incident, while whispers floated through the air like a low, ominous hum. In the center of it all stood Mrs. Evelyn Marshall, his mother, the woman who had raised him with unwavering love and strength. But in that moment, she looked fragile, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing figure of Officer Brad Weston, who was gripping her arm far too tightly. David could see the fear in her eyes, but also the resilience. His mother was not one to break easily, but she had clearly been through enough. David parked his car hastily, throwing open the door and stepping out, his face a mask of controlled fury. He straightened his suit jacket, trying to compose himself before approaching the officers. Years of legal training and military discipline had taught him how to keep his emotions in check, but right now, that self-control was being tested to its limit. As he walked toward the growing crowd, the onlookers parted for him, their eyes shifting from Mrs. Marshall to the tall, commanding figure now making his way toward the confrontation. David's reputation as a successful lawyer, coupled with his military service, preceded him in many circles, but here, on this street, he was just a concerned son coming to protect his mother. "Get your hands off my mother," David's voice rang out, calm but unmistakably firm. Officer Weston froze for a moment, his hand still gripping Mrs. Marshall's arm. Slowly, he turned to face David, his expression one of irritation and indifference. "Who the hell are you?" Weston asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. David took a measured breath and stepped closer, careful not to let the anger simmering beneath his calm surface show too soon. He didn't want this to escalate any further than it already had. "I'm her son," he said simply, his eyes locked on Weston's. "What exactly is going on here?" Weston let out a dry chuckle, clearly unimpressed. He didn't let go of Mrs. Marshall's arm. "What's going on? What's going on is your mother was wandering around the neighborhood, acting suspicious, and when we asked her for ID, she refused. That's what's going on." David's jaw tightened. He had seen this kind of behavior before, an officer flexing his authority in the most unnecessary and cruel way possible, escalating a situation that should never have existed in the first place. But David kept his cool. "My mother lives in this neighborhood," he replied, his voice steady. "She's been here for over 30 years. So why exactly are you treating her like a criminal?" Weston smirked, clearly unfazed by David's questions. "She didn't have ID," he said with a shrug. "How are we supposed to know who she was?" She refused to comply, so now she's facing arrest for loitering and disobeying an officer. David took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their phones still recording, capturing every second of this confrontation. "Let's be clear," David said, his voice rising just enough for the crowd to hear. "My mother is not loitering. She's taking a walk in her own neighborhood. And from what I can see, she hasn't disobeyed any lawful orders." Weston's smirk faltered slightly, but he still held onto his arrogance. "Yeah, and how would you know what's lawful?" Now it was David's turn to smile, but there was no warmth in it. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out his ID, his lawyer's badge, flipping it open and holding it up for Weston to see. The small, polished badge gleamed in the sunlight, but what shone brighter was the realization dawning on Weston's face. David was no ordinary bystander. "I'm David Marshall," he said clearly, his voice steady but laced with authority. "I'm a lawyer and a former military officer, and I'm very familiar with the law, probably more so than you." The shift in Weston's demeanor was immediate, though subtle. The arrogance in his eyes dulled, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. His hand, still gripping Mrs. Marshall's arm, twitched before he finally let go. David's calm, commanding presence had done what Mrs. Marshall's pleas couldn't: disrupt the officer's sense of control. The younger officer, Mitchell Quinn, looked visibly relieved. He had been growing more uncomfortable by the second, clearly aware that this situation was spinning out of control. Now, with David's arrival, Quinn saw an opportunity to backtrack. "Maybe we should listen to him, Brad," Quinn muttered, just loud enough for David to hear. But Weston wasn't ready to give in that easily. His pride had been wounded, and he wasn't about to let David humiliate him in front of the crowd. "We were following protocol," Weston said, his voice hard and defensive. "She was acting suspicious, and we had every right to detain her." David didn't raise his voice, but there was an unmistakable steel in his tone now. "Suspicious. For walking in her own neighborhood. My mother is 82 years old. She's lived here longer than you've been on this force. So unless you can explain exactly what justified this harassment, I suggest you take a step back." The crowd, sensing the power shift, murmured in agreement. People were starting to realize that David wasn't just some concerned son. He was someone who understood the law and wasn't afraid to stand up to the officers. Some of the younger bystanders, still recording, zoomed in on David's lawyer badge, making sure to capture every detail of the confrontation. Weston glanced at the crowd, then back at David. For the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. The smug confidence he had displayed earlier began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The phones pointed at him, the murmurs of the crowd, and David's unyielding stare. All of it was closing in on him, and he knew it. Quinn, sensing that the situation had reached a boiling point, stepped forward cautiously. "Sir," he began, addressing David with far more respect than Weston had shown, "maybe we can talk this out. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. We don't want this to get out of hand." David's eyes flicked to Quinn, then back to Weston. "There's no misunderstanding here," he said coldly. What you've done is racial profiling, plain and simple. You saw an elderly black woman walking in a predominantly white neighborhood and assumed she didn't belong. And now, instead of admitting that you've made a mistake, you're trying to cover it up with bogus charges. Weston stiffened, his pride flaring up again. That's not what happened, he muttered, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. Isn't it? David pressed, his voice sharp. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like that's exactly what happened. And you're lucky this crowd has been recording everything, because I'll be using this footage to make sure justice is served. The mention of the recordings made Weston falter again. He glanced at the crowd, noticing how many phones were pointed directly at him, capturing every word, every gesture. The arrogance in his expression finally cracked, and for the first time, he seemed to understand the full extent of his predicament. David, sensing the officer's growing uncertainty, stepped closer to his mother, his protective instincts kicking in. Now, here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice low and controlled. You're going to apologize to my mother. You're going to drop any ridiculous charges you threatened her with, and then you're going to walk away. Weston stared at David for a long moment, his jaw clenched tight. But he could see that the fight was over. The crowd was still recording, still watching, and there was no way out of this situation without making things worse for himself. Finally, with great reluctance, he took a step back. Fine, Weston muttered, his tone sour. But this isn't over. David didn't blink. Oh, it's over, he said firmly. Trust me. The tension in the air slowly began to dissipate as Weston, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, turned to leave. Officer Quinn, clearly relieved, followed quickly behind him, casting one last apologetic glance at David and Mrs. Marshall before retreating to the cruiser. The crowd, still buzzing with murmurs and whispers, watched as the officers got into their car and drove away, the once threatening police presence now gone. David stood next to his mother, his arm gently resting on her shoulder. The ordeal was over, for now, but the memory of what had just transpired would linger in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it, and David knew, as he held his mother close, that this fight for justice was far from finished. The crowd's energy began to shift as David continued his calm but pointed interrogation of the officers. The initial shock and confusion that had gripped the neighborhood were now giving way to a sense of righteous indignation. People who had remained passive onlookers earlier were starting to feel empowered, sensing that something profound was unfolding. A rare moment where someone was standing up to the very authority that had so often gone unchecked. David's voice, low and controlled, sliced through the tension like a razor. He didn't shout, didn't raise his tone, but every word he spoke landed with precision. Officer Brad Weston, still clinging to his authority, stood stiff, his hand resting on his belt, his expression a mix of defiance and discomfort. Officer Mitchell Quinn, on the other hand, looked visibly uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting between David and the crowd as if searching for an escape. You said you were following standard protocol, David began, his gaze fixed on Weston. So, let's talk about this so-called protocol. Is it standard protocol to stop an elderly woman for taking a walk in her own neighborhood? Is it protocol to threaten someone with arrest for not having identification while walking down the street? Weston's face tightened, but he didn't back down. We had reasonable suspicion, he replied, his voice laced with defensiveness. She was acting suspicious, and when we asked her to identify herself, she refused. That's standard procedure when someone doesn't comply. Suspicious. David repeated, his eyebrow arching slightly. Suspicious for what? Walking. Being black in a predominantly white neighborhood. Tell me exactly what part of her behavior was suspicious, because from where I'm standing, all I see is racial profiling. The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding as they recorded the exchange on their phones. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had earlier tried to intervene, stood near the front of the gathering, her eyes narrowed in disapproval as she listened to Weston's weak justifications. She had known Mrs. Marshall for years, and to see her treated like a criminal simply for existing in her own space was infuriating. Weston's expression darkened. "We don't have to explain ourselves to you. We're law enforcement. We're allowed to investigate when someone is acting suspicious." David took a step closer, his presence towering over Weston, though his voice remained steady and calm. "No, you do have to explain yourselves. You see, you don't get to just harass and intimidate people under the guise of suspicion, especially when that suspicion is rooted in nothing more than the color of their skin. That's called racial profiling, Officer Weston, and it's not standard protocol. It's a violation of my mother's rights." Quinn, standing a few feet behind Weston, swallowed hard. His discomfort was growing more apparent with each passing minute. He hadn't expected this situation to blow up like it had. When they first saw Mrs. Marshall, it had seemed like a routine stop, something simple: ask a few questions, assert authority, and move on. But now, as David's words cut through their excuses, the weight of what they had done was starting to sink in for him. Weston, however, wasn't backing down. His pride, bruised and battered, wouldn't allow him to admit fault. He straightened his posture, looking down at David with disdain. "You think you know everything because you're a lawyer, huh? You think you can just waltz in here and tell us how to do our jobs?" David's expression didn't change. He remained calm, his eyes locked on Weston's with an intensity that made the officer shift uncomfortably. "I don't need to tell you how to do your job," David replied. "But I do know the law, and I know that what you've done here today is illegal. You can try to justify it all you want, but at the end of the day, you stopped an elderly woman, my mother, because of her race. You threatened her, humiliated her, and now you're scrambling to cover it up." Weston opened his mouth to retort, but David cut him off, his voice sharp. "And let's not forget, you're not just dealing with a lawyer, you're dealing with witnesses. Dozens of people have been watching you, recording you, and everything you've done is now documented." The crowd stirred, the sound of murmurs and whispers growing louder as the gravity of David's words settled over the scene. The phones raised in the air were a silent reminder of the power shift that had taken place. It was no longer just David's word against Weston's. It was David's word backed by undeniable, irrefutable evidence. Quinn shifted uncomfortably again, glancing at the crowd and then at Weston. He knew that this had gone too far. His initial hesitation had now bloomed into full-fledged regret. The realization that their actions had been caught on camera was sinking in, and with it, the knowledge that they were no longer in control of the narrative. "We were just following protocol," Quinn mumbled, his voice barely audible. David turned his gaze to the younger officer, his eyes softening slightly, sensing Quinn's discomfort. "Is that what you think this is?" David asked. "Because right now, you have a choice. You can either continue to defend what you know is wrong, or you can do the right thing. This isn't about ego, Officer Quinn. It's about justice." Quinn's face reddened, his guilt now written plainly across his features. He opened his mouth to speak, but Weston, refusing to back down, interrupted. "We were doing our job," he snapped, his voice rising with frustration. "We're allowed to stop anyone we think is acting suspicious, and if she had just complied." "Complied with what?" David interrupted, his voice cutting through Weston's tirade. "Complied with your baseless demands. Complied with your harassment. My mother complied with everything you asked, and yet you still treated her like a criminal. Why? Because in your eyes, a black woman walking in this neighborhood automatically makes her suspicious." Weston's face flushed with anger, his arrogance faltering as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. The reality of the situation was starting to weigh on him now, the knowledge that he was being recorded, that his actions would be scrutinized not just by the people standing around him, but by anyone who saw the footage once it inevitably hit social media. "You made a mistake," David said, his voice steady and unyielding. "And now, instead of admitting it, you're trying to double down. But it's not going to work. You're going to be held accountable for what you've done here today." Quinn's eyes widened slightly at the mention of accountability. He had known from the beginning that something wasn't right, that Weston's approach had been too aggressive, too unnecessary. But now, With the threat of legal action hanging in the air, the full weight of their decisions was crashing down on him. We didn't mean for it to go this far," Quinn stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought we were just." "You thought wrong," David said, cutting him off, though his tone wasn't unkind. "And now it's time to take responsibility." Weston, still clinging to the last vestiges of his pride, clenched his jaw. "This isn't over," he growled, though his words lacked the force they had carried earlier. "Oh, it's over," David replied, his voice low and confident. "You can either walk away now, or we can take this further. And trust me, Officer Weston, if this goes to court, your career won't survive it." The crowd was silent now, their attention fully locked on the exchange. They could feel the tension shifting, the power dynamic tipping in David's favor. Weston, for all his bravado, was cornered. He could see it in the faces of the witnesses, in the raised phones still recording every second of his behavior. There was no way out for him now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Weston exhaled sharply, his posture deflating. He knew he had lost. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the patrol car, Quinn hesitating for a moment before following suit. David watched them go, his expression unreadable as the weight of the moment settled over him. The crowd, sensing that the confrontation was over, began to lower their phones, the whispers starting up again as the adrenaline of the scene slowly faded. David turned to his mother, who stood quietly beside him, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He reached out and took her hand gently, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's over," he said softly, though he knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The footage would spread and justice would come, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. As the officers drove away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the memory of what had transpired would linger in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. And David, standing tall beside his mother, knew that the tables had truly turned. In the days following the confrontation, the quiet suburban neighborhood where Mrs. Marshall had been unjustly harassed by the police was no longer quiet. What had started as an isolated incident between an elderly woman and two officers quickly became a flashpoint, igniting a firestorm that spread far beyond the boundaries of their tree-lined streets. The video, taken by multiple witnesses and shared across social media platforms, went viral within hours. Millions of people watched as Officer Weston berated and threatened Mrs. Marshall, while her son David calmly but firmly defended her and exposed the wrongful nature of the officer's actions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Outrage poured in from all corners of the country. The hashtag Justice for Ms. Marshall began trending on Twitter, and news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the incident on national television. The video showed, in stark detail, what many had long suspected, that racial profiling was still alive and well, even in neighborhoods that prided themselves on being inclusive. People were horrified to see how an innocent morning walk could turn into an act of public humiliation simply because of the color of Mrs. Marshall's skin. The video's virality forced the local police department to act quickly. Within 48 hours, the department's chief of police held a press conference, acknowledging the growing public outcry and announcing that an internal investigation had been launched. The statement was meant to placate the anger boiling over in the community, but it was clear that this was just the beginning. Officer Brad Weston, whose arrogance and aggression had sparked the incident, was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. His name became synonymous with the worst aspects of policing, those who abused their power and showed little regard for the lives they were supposed to protect. As the investigation progressed, evidence surfaced not only of his conduct with Mrs. Marshall, but of a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Complaints from other citizens, particularly in communities of color, began to surface, exposing a long history of misconduct. The public demanded action, and action they received. After weeks of mounting pressure, Officer Weston faced disciplinary measures. His suspension turned into termination, and the district attorney's office opened a separate investigation into whether charges should be brought against him for violating Mrs. Marshall's civil rights. The community's anger hadn't subsided. They wanted accountability, and they wouldn't rest until justice was fully served. Officer Mitchell Quinn, the younger officer who had hesitated but ultimately followed Weston's lead, wasn't spared from scrutiny either. The video showed his reluctance, his discomfort with the situation, but it also revealed his complicity. Though he hadn't been the one to initiate the confrontation, he had stood by and allowed it to happen. For many, that was just as damning. Quinn, overwhelmed by guilt and the shame of being associated with the viral incident, submitted his resignation shortly after the investigation began. In his resignation letter, he expressed remorse for not speaking up, acknowledging that his silence had contributed to the harm caused. Meanwhile, as the police department faced its reckoning, Mrs. Marshall found herself at the center of an unexpected whirlwind. She had never imagined that her morning walk would lead to national attention. Reporters knocked on her door, activists reached out offering support, and her face was splashed across news segments and social media posts. It was surreal, and while she appreciated the solidarity, the experience had left her shaken. Sitting in her cozy living room, surrounded by the familiar trappings of a life well lived, Mrs. Marshall reflected on the events that had unfolded. She was relieved that justice was being served, that the officers responsible for her harassment were being held accountable. But her relief was tempered by a deep sadness. She had lived through so much. Decades of civil rights struggles, moments of hope and heartbreak, and yet here she was, in her twilight years, still facing the same old demons of racism and discrimination. "It's a strange feeling," she said softly to David one evening, as they sat together on her porch, watching the sunset. "I'm glad the world saw what happened. I'm glad people are speaking out. But it breaks my heart that we're still fighting these battles. I thought maybe things had changed more." David, sitting beside her, nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Things have changed, Mom," he said gently, "but there's still a long way to go. What happened to you shouldn't have happened to anyone, but it did. And now we have a chance to push for more change, to make sure this doesn't keep happening." Mrs. Marshall sighed, the weight of her years settling into her shoulders. "I suppose you're right, but it's hard to see so much ugliness still out there." David put his hand on his mother's. "It's out there, but so is the good. Look at all the people who came together after this, the support we've gotten, the way the community rallied around you. It's a reminder that there's still hope, and we're going to keep fighting." David wasn't just saying those words for comfort. In the wake of the incident, he had thrown himself even deeper into his work as a lawyer and advocate for police reform. The experience had only solidified his resolve to fight against injustice, to push for greater accountability within the system. He knew that what had happened to his mother was far from an isolated event, and he was determined to use his platform to shine a light on similar cases, to ensure that no one else would have to endure the kind of treatment his mother had faced. In the months following the viral video, David worked tirelessly with local activists and organizations to push for meaningful reforms in the city's police department. New policies were introduced, mandatory bias training, stronger oversight of officers with a history of complaints, and a commitment to transparency in investigations of misconduct. The police department, under immense public pressure, couldn't ignore the calls for change. At the same time, the community rallied around Mrs. Marshall in ways that warmed her heart. Neighbors who had once been silent or indifferent now went out of their way to check in on her, to offer words of kindness and solidarity. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been frozen with fear during the confrontation, became one of her closest allies, organizing community meetings to discuss issues of race and policing. Local businesses, schools, and churches began to host events focused on unity, inclusion, and education, determined to learn from the incident and ensure that their neighborhood became a model for positive change. As weeks turned into months, the story of what had happened that morning faded from the headlines, but the impact remained. Mrs. Marshall, though still deeply affected by the experience, found solace in the knowledge that her ordeal had sparked something larger, something meaningful. One afternoon, as she sat in her garden, tending to her beloved flowers, she smiled to herself. The road ahead would be long, and there would still be challenges to face, but in the wake of darkness, light had emerged. Her son David continued his fight for justice. Her neighbors, once passive, had become allies, and the police department, for all its flaws, had been forced to confront its shortcomings. Mrs. Marshall looked up at the sky, the sun shining warmly on her face. "We've come a long way," she whispered to herself, "and we're not done yet." The story ended not with a sweeping victory, but with the quiet, steady hope that comes with progress. Justice had been served, change was in motion, and in that small suburban neighborhood, a new sense of community was taking root. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and for Mrs. Marshall, that was enough to keep moving forward.